I'm Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and the day we laid my grandfather to rest felt like the day the ground disappeared under my feet. The wind at the cemetery cut straight through my black coat, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran through me when his casket began to lower into the earth. I was staring at his name on the brass plate, trying to steady my breathing, when my stepmother leaned close enough that I could feel her perfume in the cold air. Her lips barely moved, but her words sliced clean through my grief as she whispered that I should not expect a single dollar from his will. For a second, the world went strangely quiet, even though people were still shifting and sniffing and murmuring around us. I felt my fingers tighten around the funeral program until the paper started to crumple, and I realized every eye nearby had turned toward us. By the time I found my voice, she was already wearing a small, satisfied smile that told me this moment was not an accident. Somewhere deep down, standing there beside the man who had saved my life, I knew this was only the beginning of a fight I never asked for. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone thought they could write you out of your own family. Make sure you tap that like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I grew up in a world that smelled like fried food and laundry detergent, not polished wood and imported flowers. My parents ran a tiny diner off a state highway in Ohio, the kind of place where truckers knew everyone by name, and my bedroom was a converted storage room above the kitchen. When I was 14, a drunk driver took both of them in one night, and suddenly the only sounds in that little apartment were the hum of the refrigerator and my own footsteps on the worn linoleum. I barely knew my grandfather then. Jonathan Carter was the man in the newspaper, the man on the business channel, the billionaire who built towers in cities I had never even visited. But he showed up at the funeral in a dark overcoat and work-tired eyes, and instead of offering polite condolences and disappearing, he took my hand and told me I would not be going back to an empty apartment. Moving into his estate outside Chicago was like stepping onto another planet. My old world had chipped plates and a second-hand TV that flickered at the edges. His world had marble floors that echoed when you walked a staircase you could get lost on, and a driveway long enough that the first time I saw it, I thought it was a private road. I remember standing in my new bedroom staring at a bed big enough for 3 people and curtains that matched the walls feeling small and out of place. Jonathan must have seen it on my face, because he sat down on the edge of that bed, loosened his tie, and told me that this might be his house, but it was my home now. From that day forward, he insisted that I call him Grandpa, not Mr. Carter. At the breakfast table, over the smell of fresh coffee and toast, he talked more about hard work and decency than about the deals everyone else wanted to hear about. Grandpa liked to remind me that money could build high walls, but it could not make a person worth admiring. He taught me to look people in the eye, to say thank you to servers and security guards, to understand that everyone in the room mattered, not just the ones in expensive suits. On weeknights when he came home from meetings, he would lose his jacket, roll up his sleeves, and help me with my homework at the long oak table in his study. The shelves behind him were full of leather-bound books, but he always pulled down the same old chess set, setting it up between us, and using the pieces to explain strategy, patience, and what happened when greed blinded you to the rest of the board. He told me more than once that the world would expect me to be spoiled, careless, a rich man's granddaughter, and that my job was to prove them wrong by the way I treated people. Linda arrived in our lives years later like a gust of perfume and camera flashes. I was in college by then, coming home on breaks to a house that felt the same and different all at once. She was beautiful in that polished magazine way, perfect hair, perfect nails, dresses that looked like they'd never seen a washing machine. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, telling myself that Jonathan had earned the right to companionship, that I was grown, and there was room in his life for someone new. But small things started to chip at that story, the way she rolled her eyes when he stopped to talk to the gardeners, how she called his scholarship dinners charity spectacles, the time she told me half-laughing that people like us did not need to worry about things like budgets and grocery sales. Where Grandpa measured success in the number of lives he could help, Linda measured it in tables reserved, invitations received, and the size of the diamond on her finger. Still, Jonathan never treated me like a guest in his home. He invited me into meetings at Parker Development after I finished my business degree, encouraged me to ask questions, and told the executives to listen when I offered an opinion instead of patting me on the head. On weekends, he would walk with me through the garden behind the house, his steps slower than they had been when I was 14, but his mind as sharp as ever. Those walks were where he talked about what would happen someday when he was gone, and he told me that buildings and bank accounts did not impress him half as much as the person I was becoming. He never promised me numbers or titles, just that he had made arrangements to see that I was all right, and that his name would mean something more than just money. I believed him not because of the size of his estate, but because he had already saved me once from a life that could have swallowed me whole. All of that was running through my mind as the pastor said his final words and the casket disappeared from view. The March wind tugged at my hair, made the corners of the black tent above us snap and shiver, while Linda dabbed theatrically at the corner of one eye with a monogrammed handkerchief. When she leaned in close and told me not to expect anything, her voice was calm, almost casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. A few people near us shifted uncomfortable, pretending not to hear, even as their faces tightened, and I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. I wanted to answer her right there to defend the man we had just buried, but the words lodged somewhere behind my ribs, trapped beneath a grief that had not yet settled into something I could name. As people began to drift away toward their cars, boots and heels leaving tracks in the damp grass, I stayed where I was. The crowd thinned, the murmur of sympathy faded, and soon it was just me, the fresh mound of earth, and the headstone with my grandfather's name carved into it, below the dates that marked his long, complicated life. I rested my hand against the cold stone and thought about scholarships he had funded, families he had helped keep in their homes, the nights he had sat up with me when I was sick or scared. The idea that a man like that would simply forget me, would hand everything over to a woman who treated kindness like a weakness, did not fit with anything I knew about him. Standing there with the program crushed in my fist and Linda's words still hanging in the air, I felt something inside me shift. Not enough to call it courage yet, but enough to keep me from walking away. By the time I finally turned toward the parking lot, the sky had gone from gray to a flat, heavy silver that promised rain, and the last cars were pulling out onto the road. I could see Linda in the distance laughing at something one of Jonathan's old acquaintances said, her arm looped through his, as if the day had already turned into an opportunity. I knew then that whatever my grandfather had put in place, she was counting on owning every inch of his world, including the house I had slept in for over a decade. I tucked the funeral program into my purse, took a slow breath, and told myself that I would find out exactly what he had arranged, no matter how many lawyers or locked doors stood between me and the truth. I had no idea yet how quickly that truth would be used against me, or how far my grandfather had gone to make sure that in the end she would not be the only one holding the keys. The parking lot outside the cemetery was nearly empty when I finally reached my car. The sky had turned a deeper gray, the kind that makes even spring afternoons feel like winter, and a thin drizzle began to dot the windshield as I pulled out onto the main road. I kept replaying Linda's voice in my head, the way she said those words so quietly that no one else was meant to hear them, and the way she smiled as if the moment belonged to her alone. By the time the tall gates of the Carter estate came into view, the drizzle had turned into steady rain, and the mansion lights glowed softly through the mist, looking almost untouched by the day we had just lived through. I slowed as the tires crunched up the long drive, expecting the familiar comfort of walking through the front door. But something at the top of the stairs made me sit up straight. 3 suitcases. My suitcases were lined neatly against the entrance, their tags facing outward as if they were waiting for a taxi. I stepped out of the car and climbed the front steps with the rain slipping down the back of my coat. My initials were stitched on the side of each bag, in the thread my grandfather insisted on when he had them made for me after college. I reached out and brushed my hand across one of them, the fabric damp and cold, and the heavy oak doors swung open, before I could gather a single thought. Linda stood in the doorway, wearing a silk robe in a deep wine color, holding a glass of red that caught the warm chandelier light behind her. "Oh, good," she said, leaning her shoulder against the frame as if she were waiting for a friend. "This saves me the trouble of having them delivered to a motel. It took a moment for her meaning to settle in, and when it did, I felt the air leave my chest. The rain hit the back of my neck as I looked from her face to the bags and back again. "What is all this?" I asked, though the answer was already sinking into me. "This." She lifted her glass lightly. "Just tidying up. The house is mine now, and it seemed wiser to start early." I stepped closer, trying to see past her into the foyer that had been my home for more than a decade. "You can't be serious, Linda. It's been 1 day since the funeral." She tilted her head, her smile smooth and practiced. "It was Jonathan's home, Emily. And now it's mine. You being here was always temporary." I tried to move around her toward the open door, but she shifted her body just enough to block the entrance. Her expression hardened slightly, a controlled sharpness that replaced the soft sympathy she had worn in front of the mourners earlier. "You won't be staying here tonight," she said firmly, "or any other night." My pulse hammered in my ears, and I took a slow breath as I tried to steady my voice. "Grandpa never intended for me to be thrown out. You know that." Linda set her wine glass on the small console table just inside the door and picked up a thin manila envelope. She held it out to me with 2 fingers, as though the paper itself were beneath her. "Jonathan signed this. Last year," she said. "It states that your residency here ends upon his death." Rain pooled on the stone steps as I opened the envelope. Under the porch light, Jonathan's signature looked unmistakably real, precise, and steady as always. My stomach tightened as I read the clause, the language cold and clinical. "You expect me to believe this wasn't forged?" She let out a soft laugh, the kind meant to imply she was above the accusation. "Believe what you want. The law will recognize it. And in 15 minutes, if you're still standing here, Mark will escort you off the property." Behind her, the security supervisor, Mark Phillips, stood stiffly near the hallway, his face drawn and uncomfortable. We weren't strangers. He had watched over me for years. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and he looked away, his jaw tightening as though he had already been instructed not to intervene. I closed the envelope and held it at my side. "This isn't what he wanted," I said quietly. Linda smoothed the belt of her robe, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "It's what the paperwork says," she replied. "That's all that matters." The front door began to close slowly as she stepped back, and I heard the heavy bolts slide into place one by one. The mansion lights dimmed behind the glass, leaving me on the stone steps in the pouring rain with my belongings at my feet. I stood there for another moment, long enough for water to soak through my sleeves and drip from my hair before picking up the first suitcase handle and turning toward the driveway. By the time I reached my car, rainwater had seeped into the edges of my shoes and pooled at the cuffs of my coat. I opened the trunk and set the bags inside, taking care not to slam anything, though I was shaking too much to be sure what I was doing was even steady. The road outside the estate was nearly empty as I pulled onto it, the wipers smearing the water across the windshield in long, uneven strokes. The neon sign of the Lakeview Motor Inn flickered between pink and blue as I pulled into the lot, its hum cutting through the sound of the rain. I stepped into the small lobby where an older woman behind the counter looked up from a magazine and set a brass key on the desk without asking many questions. The hall smelled faintly of old cigarettes and industrial cleaner, and my shoes left damp prints on the thin carpet as I walked to room 112. Inside, the bedspread was faded and worn, covered in a pattern of flowers that had probably been bright once. I set my bags beside the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking slightly under my weight. The air felt heavy and still, the kind of quiet that made every breath too loud. I lowered my face into my hands and took slow breaths, the gravity of the day settling over me all at once. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring at the chipped paint near the window frame and listening to the rain hit the glass in uneven bursts. The room was dim, except for the small lamp beside the bed, casting a yellow pool of light that made the shadows longer. I lay back across the blanket, staring at the low ceiling as the events of the evening replayed in precise order. The suitcases, the document, the click of the bolts, the way Linda turned off the lights as if she were closing a chapter she no longer needed. Just as I began to drift into an uneasy half-sleep, the old rotary phone on the nightstand rang sharply. The sound was jarring in the quiet room, and I sat up too quickly, nearly knocking the lamp sideways. I stared at the phone as it rang again, the metallic ring cutting through the still air. I picked up the receiver with a cautious hand. "Hello, Emily," a calm, steady voice responded. "This is Daniel Brooks." I straightened instinctively, surprised he had found me so easily. "Mr. Brooks, how did you—" "Your grandfather made certain I would know," he said. "He expected complications." The words hung in the air, and I felt a faint steadiness return to me. "Complications," I repeated quietly. "I can't discuss details now." He continued, his tone warm but measured. "But I want you to understand something clearly." Jonathan prepared thoroughly. "You were never forgotten." I sat back down on the bed, gripping the receiver more tightly. The firm reassurance in his voice created a small shift in the room, like a window being opened. "Linda told me everything was hers." I said, my voice low. "People often say things they want to believe," he replied. "But the truth is in the will. It will be read on Friday at 2:00. I expect you there." The line clicked, leaving me holding the receiver against my ear as the steady hum of the dial tone filled the silence. I set it gently back onto the cradle and exhaled, my shoulders softening just enough for me to lie back on the bed again. Outside, the rain had steadied into a lighter, more even rhythm, tapping along the metal frame of the window. I closed my eyes, hearing Daniel's words over and over. He prepared thoroughly. As I settled into the thin motel pillow, the ache of the day lingered, but the sharp edges dulled slightly. I didn't know what the will would reveal, or what Linda expected to gain by locking me out so quickly. But the quiet certainty in Daniel's voice stayed with me as the room finally blurred into sleep. And when morning came, I knew Friday would decide far more than anyone had let on. Morning light crept through the thin motel curtains, a pale, washed-out glow that made the room look even smaller than it had the night before. I lay still for a moment, listening to the steady hum of traffic from the road outside and the soft drip of water from the gutter above my window. The exhaustion from the day before clung to me like a weight, but Daniel's late-night call lingered just as strongly. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, as the events of the last 24 hours settled into place in a way that felt both unreal and strangely sharp. My suitcases were stacked near the door, still damp at the edges, a reminder of how quickly everything had shifted. I wrapped my sweater tighter around me and walked toward the small sink beside the bathroom. The mirror above it was slightly fogged from the damp air, and when I turned on the faucet, the water sputtered before running clean. I splashed my face and let my hand rest on the cool porcelain breathing in the faint scent of old soap and bleach. The motel didn't offer breakfast, so I made do with a cup of coffee from the vending machine in the lobby, its warmth settling into my hands as I stepped back into the room. The hours between morning and early afternoon moved slowly. I tried to read pacing between the bed and the small table as the coffee cooled on the nightstand. Every so often my gaze drifted to my phone, though I had no messages from anyone except a short confirmation from Daniel with the law office address. When noon approached, I pulled out the black suit I had worn to the funeral, brushed off the faint wrinkles, and smoothed the fabric carefully. Dressing in that small room felt different than getting ready in the mansion's wide hallways, the air tighter and more still, but it gave me something steady to focus on. The drive into the city took nearly 40 minutes. Storm clouds still hung low over the skyline, but the rain had stopped, leaving streaks on the windshield that caught the afternoon light in dull glimmers. When I parked near the tall glass building where Daniel's office was located, I sat in the car for another moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting myself breathe in slowly. A few deep breaths later, I stepped out, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby was filled with soft music and the scent of fresh flowers from an arrangement near the elevator bank. The marble floor reflected light upward, and the people moving through the space seemed focused and brisk, each carrying folders or briefcases as they headed to their floors. I pressed the button for the elevator and rode up to the 28th floor, watching the numbers blink higher until the doors slid open to reveal a quiet hallway lined with dark wood panels. Daniel's office door was halfway open, and he greeted me with a small nod when I stepped inside. His desk was neatly arranged papers, stacked near his hand, and a window behind him offered a view of the city spread out in gray and glass. "Emily," he said gently, motioning toward a chair. "I'm glad you made it." "Thank you for calling last night," I replied, taking the seat opposite him. I wasn't sure what to expect. He folded his hands on the desk. "Your grandfather wanted things handled clearly. Today is the first step." Before I could ask what that meant, the sound of footsteps in the hall drew my attention. When I turned, Linda was standing in the doorway. She wore a tailored black suit, her hair styled in soft waves that fell over one shoulder. Her attorney, a sharply dressed woman with a leather briefcase, stepped in beside her. Linda's gaze swept over me and she offered a brief smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "you look rested." Daniel stood maintaining a calm, professional expression. "Mrs. Carter, please take a seat. We'll begin shortly." We moved into the conference room, a long space with polished wood paneling and a large table at its center. Two witnesses were already seated, Helen Morris and Robert King, both offering me subtle nods when our eyes met. Helen's face carried the faint strain of the last few days, but her presence brought a steadiness to the room that helped ease the tension in my chest. I took a seat across from Linda. Her attorney sat close beside her, opening her briefcase and pulling out a notepad and pen. The atmosphere was thick with the anticipation of whatever would come next. Daniel stood at the head of the table and opened a large folder filled with documents. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today we honor the wishes of Jonathan Carter. This will was drafted with his full clarity and intention." Linda crossed her legs and leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the papers in Daniel's hands. I kept my hands folded in my lap, trying to ground my breathing as he began reading aloud. The preliminary bequests were simple and expected. According to the will, Linda was granted the family residence along with its furnishings and Jonathan's collection of vehicles. She shifted slightly in her chair, glancing toward me as if waiting for a reaction, but I remained still. Daniel's voice never wavered as he continued. "That concludes the initial provisions," he said, adjusting the pages. "There are additional clauses that require the attention of everyone present." Linda sat up straighter, and her attorney's hand paused over the notepad. The witnesses both leaned forward slightly, their expressions focused and intent. Daniel cleared his throat. Jonathan Carter made very deliberate decisions regarding the remainder of his estate. He lifted his eyes to meet mine before reading further. "To my granddaughter, Emily Carter, I leave 50% of Carter Properties and all affiliated holdings, including voting rights shares and dividends." The room froze. The words echoed in my mind, settling slowly into something I could hardly process. The company was the heartbeat of everything Jonathan had built its value beyond anything I had imagined. I felt my breath catch, though I kept my gaze on Daniel, waiting for him to continue. Across from me, Linda's posture stiffened. Her hands tightened around the armrests as she leaned forward, her voice sharp. "This must be a mistake. There's no reason for her to control half of the company." Daniel answered calmly. His intentions were documented clearly. "This provision reflects his wishes." Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering something, but Linda waved her off, her attention fixed on me. I didn't look away. Daniel continued reading through additional allocations, personal items, charitable trusts, and legacy projects. The specifics blurred together, my focus anchored to the single truth that my grandfather had entrusted me with more than I had ever expected. When Daniel finally closed the will, the silence in the room felt heavy and electric. Helen reached out slightly as if to offer comfort, though her hand remained folded in her lap. Robert gave a firm nod, his expression one of quiet approval. Linda broke the silence first. "She doesn't deserve this," she said, her voice low but edged with strain. Jonathan must have been confused. Daniel opened a file containing statements from Jonathan's medical team. He was evaluated several times in the months before drafting this will. His cognitive function was clear and stable. Her attorney finally intervened, placing a hand gently on Linda's arm. "We can discuss your concerns privately," she murmured. Linda looked back at me again, her expression tight with disbelief. The air between us felt charged, though neither of us spoke. I stayed seated, hands steady in my lap, as Daniel gathered the documents. He gave me a small nod, signaling that the meeting was ending. Chairs slid back one by one, and the room slowly emptied. Helen approached me, resting a warm hand on my arm. "He believed in you," she said softly. "He wanted this." Robert added a similar sentiment, offering a brief handshake before stepping out into the hallway. Linda lingered behind her attorney, watching me quietly, before turning away without a word. When the door finally closed, I exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty settle in. I still needed time to understand everything that had unfolded. Daniel approached with a calm expression. "There is one more matter we need to address," he said, "but we'll go through that separately." I nodded, sensing the shift in his tone. Something else was waiting, something that would shape what came next. Daniel waited until the door had closed behind the others before taking his seat again. He rested his hands on the folder in front of him, the edges of the papers perfectly aligned, as though he wanted everything in place before speaking. I stayed where I was, my fingers loosely interlaced in my lap, trying to steady myself after the reading of the will. The room felt too large for the two of us, the polished walls carrying every sound more clearly than I expected. Daniel looked at me with a quiet patience before opening a separate envelope, one I hadn't seen before. "There is something Jonathan wanted addressed only after the will was read," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity to it that settled over the table. "It concerns recent events at the estate." I nodded slowly. "What do you mean?" He folded open the top page and rotated it slightly so I could see the bold header at the top. "Your grandfather anticipated that tensions might rise after his passing," he said. "He wanted protections in place for you." I leaned in, scanning the first few lines. The language was formal, the kind that required a second read to fully grasp, but one detail caught my attention immediately. Jonathan had created a conditional provision tied directly to my right to remain at the estate. I felt a brief pause in my breath as Daniel continued. "He was clear," Daniel said quietly. "If you were forced out of the house within a year of his death, certain parts of the estate would transfer to you rather than remain with Linda." I sat back slowly, letting his words settle. The rain from the night before flashed briefly in my memory, the packed suitcases, the locked door, the lights going dark behind me. He really prepared for all this. Daniel gave a small nod. He understood people better than most, and he understood this situation. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table as the weight of it began to make sense. He gestured toward the envelope. "There's also a recording. He wanted you to hear it at the right time." The mention of a recording made something shift in my chest. I nodded for him to continue, and he reached for a small remote on the table. A screen on the wall lit up the image, slightly grainy at first, before sharpening. My grandfather appeared, seated in his study, with the warm lamplight behind him. He looked older than he had the year before, but his eyes were steady, clear, and unmistakably his. "Emily," he began. His voice filled the room even, and measured, carrying the same tone he used when explaining a chess move or a complicated deal. "If you're watching this, I'm not here to tell you how to feel, but I want you to understand that my decisions were made for your security and for the legacy I spent my life building." He paused, folding his hands the way he always did, before saying something more serious. "I trust you to carry this forward. I trust your character, your judgment, and your heart. If anyone challenges your place in this family or in this home, then the steps I've taken will speak for me." I watched him closely, taking in every detail, the familiar lift of his eyebrow, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name, the quiet strength in his posture. When the video ended, the screen dimmed, leaving the room silent except for the low hum of the overhead lights. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the dark screen, letting his voice linger in my mind, the steady reassurance of it settling into something I hadn't realized I needed. Daniel closed the folder carefully and placed it aside. He recorded that 3 weeks before he passed, Daniel said. He wanted no questions about his state of mind. I exhaled slowly. It felt like he was sitting across from me. Daniel offered a small, understanding smile. Jonathan always made his intentions clear. I stood from my chair, too restless to stay seated. The window beside the conference room looked out over the city, the rooftops lined in gray, the streets far below carrying the steady flow of afternoon traffic. My reflection faintly overlapped the view steady enough, but carrying the weight of everything the day had brought. "I don't know how Linda will take this," I said quietly. "She won't be pleased," Daniel admitted. "But she'll have no room to dispute what Jonathan documented. The language is firm." I nodded, absorbing his words. It was a strange combination of relief and unease. The support my grandfather had woven into his final plans brought a sense of clarity, but the reality of what Linda had already done hovered just beneath it. I walked back to the table as Daniel gathered the documents. "I want you to understand something else," he said gently. "Jonathan's provisions weren't just about the estate. They were about acknowledging your place in his life. He wanted that recognized." The comment settled in a quiet space inside me. I didn't answer right away, but I felt the truth in what he said. Jonathan had spent years guiding me, teaching me, and giving me opportunities I never would have imagined for myself. This, everything he had put into motion, was an extension of that same care. Daniel stood and closed his briefcase. "We'll need to schedule a follow-up meeting for the next steps, but for now, I want you to take the evening to let this settle." I nodded again, appreciating the steady patience in his tone. When we stepped out into the hallway, the building seemed quieter than before. Helen was waiting near the elevator with her purse in hand. She offered a warm, sympathetic smile when she saw me. "How did it go?" she asked gently. I took a moment before answering. "A lot was uncovered," I said softly, "more than I expected." She nodded as though she understood more than she was saying. "Your grandfather always planned things with care," she said. "He believed in being prepared." The elevator doors opened, and the three of us stepped inside. When we reached the lobby, Helen squeezed my hand before heading toward the revolving doors. Daniel walked with me to the building entrance. "Remember," he said, pausing just before I stepped outside, "whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone." Jonathan made sure of that. I thanked him quietly and walked out into the cool afternoon air. The clouds had thinned since morning, and a pale stretch of sunlight fell across the sidewalk. The city moved with its usual rhythm, cars passing people, talking horns, sounding in the distance, but everything around me felt slightly muted. I stood still for a moment, letting the air settle around me. As I walked back toward my car, the envelope Daniel had given me felt heavier in my hand. The recording, the clauses, the clear intentions, it all pointed to something my grandfather had known before anyone else had said a word. He anticipated the divide Linda would create. He had prepared for the blow before it happened, and now with each step toward the parking garage, I could sense the shift ahead. Whatever I had believed was over was only just beginning. The drive back to the motel felt longer than the one into the city. I parked in the same spot as before and sat for a moment letting the engine idle, while the events of the afternoon replayed through my mind in slow, steady pieces. My grandfather's voice from the recording echoed most clearly, carrying that familiar firmness I had grown up with. Hearing him speak so directly even after he was gone left a stillness inside me that stayed with me as I walked into the room. I set the envelope from Daniel on the dresser, changed into more comfortable clothes, and let the rest of the evening pass quietly. By the time I lay down, the weight of the day had settled into a tired calm that followed me into sleep. The next morning was crisp and clear, a break from the gray weather that had hung over the city since the funeral. I opened the curtains halfway and let the early sunlight settle across the worn carpet. The stillness outside made the motel feel a little less heavy. I made a cup of coffee with the small machine near the sink and sat on the edge of the bed, taking slow sips as I looked over the notes Daniel had given me. With each passing minute, I felt myself becoming steadier, as though my grandfather's careful planning was lending me the strength I needed. Just after 9, my phone buzzed. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered quickly. "Emily," he said in a measured tone, "I wanted to check on you before we finalize the next steps." "I'm all right," I replied, still taking everything in. "That's understandable," he said. "There are documents for you to review, but nothing urgent today. I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting for early next week." "That works," I said, standing to reach for a pen. "Is there anything else I should be preparing for?" There was a short pause on the other end before he spoke again. "For now, just focus on gathering your thoughts. We're approaching a turning point." His words were deliberate, carrying the hint of something he wasn't ready to name yet. We arranged a time for Monday morning, and after we hung up, I slipped on my shoes and decided to get some air. The small diner next to the motel had a narrow row of booths and the soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I ordered eggs and toast and sat by the window, watching the quiet movements of the morning outside. The simplicity of the place reminded me of the diner my parents had owned when I was a child, the smell of breakfast food, the scrape of forks on plates, the way sunlight filtered in at a certain angle. It was a grounding moment I didn't realize I needed. When I finished, I walked back to the motel with a little more ease than when I had left. The rest of the day moved without urgency. I spent some time organizing the papers Daniel had given me, laying them out neatly on the small table. Each document made clearer just how intentional my grandfather had been in his planning. His handwriting appeared in several notes attached to specific folders, steady and familiar, as though he had written them only a few days earlier. Seeing those pages helped steady my breathing, reminding me that even in the moments he anticipated conflict, he had approached it with clarity. By late afternoon, I felt the need to move around. I walked outside toward a small park a block away. The air was cooler, and children were playing near a row of trees, while a couple of joggers passed by. I sat on a bench, letting my hands rest in my lap, as the breeze lifted the edges of my hair. It was the first time since the funeral that I felt something close to normalcy. The quiet morning, the diner, the walk, it all added up to a rhythm I didn't know I had been missing. Just as the sun began to dip lower, my phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID listed a number from the Carter estate. I hesitated before answering. "Hello, Ms. Carter. This is Mark," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a faint strain. "I wanted to reach out regarding the events the other night." I sat up straighter on the bench. "All right. I followed the instructions given to me," he continued, "but I wanted you to know. Many of us at the estate were surprised by how quickly things unfolded." His tone held something careful, as though he was choosing each word with thought. I appreciated the acknowledgement, even if it didn't change what had happened. "I understand," I said. "If you need anything in the future," he added, "you can reach out directly." It was a simple gesture, but it settled into the quiet space between us in a way that felt sincere. We exchanged a few more words before ending the call. As I walked back toward the motel, I tucked the phone into my pocket, the strain across my chest easing a little. Evening arrived with the soft glow of streetlights flickering on. I warmed some soup in the microwave and sat eating slowly as I looked over the envelope from Daniel again. The pages inside reflected the care and clarity of Jonathan's mind, and each detail reminded me how deeply he had thought about protecting what mattered. After washing the bowl in the small sink, I changed into comfortable clothes and settled onto the bed, leaning back against the pillows as I tried to let the day settle. My thoughts drifted from the conference room to the video recording to the steady way Daniel had walked me through each step. As the quiet grew deeper, something shifted in the stillness. I realized I was no longer replaying the night I had been forced out. Instead, I was thinking about what came next, about the weight of the responsibility Jonathan had placed in my hands. The fear that had followed me since the funeral softened into something calmer, not confidence exactly, but an awareness of the road ahead. When I finally turned off the lamp, the room fell into darkness, except for a small stripe of light from the parking lot outside. I lay there listening to the faint sounds through the walls, the hum of the vending machine, the distant footsteps of someone heading toward their room. It was a simple environment far from the estate I had known for so long, but something about that simplicity grounded me. I closed my eyes and let my breathing slow. The past few days had carried shock, confusion, and the weight of sudden change. But beneath all of it, my grandfather's voice from the recording stayed with me. I held on to that steadiness as sleep began to settle in. And by morning, I knew that the next step, the one waiting just ahead, would bring the shift that had been building quietly since the night I left the estate. Sleep came in short stretches that night, broken by the familiar hum of the motel's heating system and the occasional car moving across the gravel outside. When morning finally arrived, the sun had already climbed high, filling the room with a flat light that made it difficult to tell how early it was. I got dressed slowly, choosing a simple blouse and dark slacks, and took a moment to gather the papers I needed for the meeting at Daniel's office. The drive into the city felt strangely calm, as though the quiet of the past 2 days had settled into something more solid. By the time I parked, I could feel a steadiness inside me that hadn't been there before. Inside the building, the lobby was brighter than it had been earlier in the week. People moved with purpose, and the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cart drifted through the air. I rode the elevator to the 28th floor, the soft chime sounding just before the doors opened onto the familiar hallway. Daniel's assistant greeted me and led me to the same conference room where the will had been read. As I stepped inside, I saw that Linda was already seated at the long table, her attorney beside her. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped tightly on the polished surface. Daniel entered a moment later, carrying a smaller stack of documents than before. He nodded at each of us before taking his place at the head of the table. "Thank you for returning," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that settled across the room. "There is a matter that remains unresolved, one that Jonathan addressed in a separate provision." Linda shifted in her chair, her gaze sharp but steady. "I assume this won't take long," she said quietly, though the tension in her shoulders suggested she already suspected otherwise. Daniel opened the folder in front of him and pulled out a single envelope, heavier than the others I had seen. He placed it carefully on the table. "Jonathan created a conditional clause," he said, "one that concerns the events following his passing." I felt my breath pause. Linda's attorney leaned forward slightly, pen poised above her notepad. Daniel continued, speaking clearly. "The clause activates if Emily is ever removed from the Carter residence against her will within 1 year of Jonathan's death." A stillness fell over the room. I watched as Linda blinked once slowly, as though processing each word individually. Daniel lifted a second document. "We have statements from staff confirming what took place the night Emily returned to the estate," he said, "and security reports documenting your instruction to remove her from the premises." Linda's attorney placed a hand on her arm, but she didn't look away from Daniel. "This is being twisted," she murmured. "The house is mine. She had no legal right to stay." Daniel drew a breath. "That brings us to Jonathan's final instruction." He reached for a small remote on the table and pressed a button. The screen on the wall brightened, and the familiar image of Jonathan sitting in his study appeared once more. He looked steady, his hands folded gently in front of him. The sound of his voice filled the room, clear and deliberate. "If this message is being viewed," he said, "then a choice has been made without compassion. I wanted my granddaughter protected, not only through documents, but through my own words. If she is cast out of the home she shared with me, that action speaks for itself." Linda's shoulders tensed, but her gaze remained locked on the screen. Jonathan continued, "In such a case, all assets granted to my wife, our residence, our vehicles, and the liquid accounts will transfer to Emily. It is my intent that any act of exclusion be met with clarity rather than conflict." His voice softened as he spoke my name. "Emily, you have always treated others with respect and patience. That is the foundation I trust. And if you face resistance, this measure ensures you have the support you need." The video ended, and the room fell silent except for the faint hum of the lights overhead. Linda's attorney laid her pen down slowly as though unsure what to say. Linda sat rigid, her fingers curled against the armrest, her expression unreadable. Daniel waited a moment before speaking. "This clause carries full legal weight. It was reviewed, notarized, and witnessed. His doctors confirmed his clarity on the date it was recorded." Linda finally spoke, her voice strained. "I didn't force her out. She left." Daniel lifted the sealed security report. "The camera footage and staff statements say otherwise." Linda's attorney leaned closer, whispering something under her breath, but Linda didn't respond right away. She lowered her gaze to the table, her breathing shallow and uneven. I watched the conflict move across her features, subtle but real, as she weighed the reality of what had been laid before us. Robert entered, then having been called to join us as a secondary witness. He nodded at me gently before taking a seat near the end of the table. "Jonathan warned me he expected something like this," he said quietly. He trusted Daniel to follow through. Linda's lifted her head at the sound of his voice, though she didn't speak. Daniel gathered the documents. "The transfer of assets is now automatic," he said. "We will begin the process immediately." Linda's eyes widened slightly, though she remained silent. Her attorney straightened, preparing to respond, but Daniel continued before she could. "You may challenge this in court," he said calmly, "but every aspect of the clause has been validated. The evidence is clear. Jonathan anticipated a situation in which Emily would be treated unfairly, and he prepared for that fully." The room stayed still for several beats, the meaning of those words filling the space in a way that felt both heavy and final. I sat quietly, the envelope of legal documents resting near my hand, the video of my grandfather still echoing in my mind. Linda's attorney collected her things and placed a steadying hand on her client's arm. "We'll discuss next steps privately," she said. Linda rose quietly, her movements controlled, though her eyes remained fixed on the papers Daniel had set aside. She offered no parting words as they exited, only a brief glance in my direction before the door closed behind them. When they were gone, the room felt brighter, as though tension had lifted slightly. Daniel gave a small nod in my direction. "This is the moment Jonathan prepared you for," he said. I breathed slowly, letting the truth settle. The shift had happened, not through confrontation or anger, but through the careful steps Jonathan had planned long before this day ever arrived. As we filed out into the hallway, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the tall windows. Helen met me near the elevator with a gentle smile. "Your grandfather knew your strength," she said softly. "He trusted it." Her words stayed with me during the ride down each floor, passing quietly until the lobby doors opened. I stepped outside into the cool air, the city moving with its steady rhythm around me. What waited ahead was clear now, not just a legal victory, but the beginning of everything Jonathan had entrusted me to carry forward. The next steps would bring decisions, responsibilities, and the unraveling of whatever fight remained. And I was finally ready to face all of it. The days that followed moved with a quiet steadiness, even though everything around me seemed to shift at once. Daniel worked through the legal transitions with his usual calm precision, guiding me through each form and signature needed to finalize the changes Jonathan had set in motion. Each morning I met with him in his office to review the progress, and each afternoon I returned to the motel with a stack of neatly organized documents that carried more weight than I had known to expect. The process was careful and deliberate, but there was no confusion about the outcome. Jonathan's instructions left little room for question, and Daniel never rushed any part of the work. Outside the office, the story of the clause began to circulate quietly among those who had known my grandfather well. I received a brief message from Robert one evening, letting me know he supported everything Jonathan had intended. Helen also reached out to check on me, her voice warm and steady when she said she was relieved to see things unfolding as Jonathan had wanted. Their support helped anchor me in the midst of changes that were both practical and deeply personal. One afternoon, Daniel called to let me know the judge had reviewed the final documents. I drove downtown and parked outside the courthouse, taking in the sight of the tall stone steps rising before me. Inside, the waiting area was quiet, and when Daniel joined me, his expression was calm but firm. "The judge is prepared to finalize the ruling today," he said. "This will settle everything." I nodded, feeling a slow breath move through me. We entered the small courtroom where a handful of people were already seated. Linda sat at a table with her attorney, her posture composed, but her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't look in my direction when Daniel and I took our seats across the aisle. The judge reviewed the case with deliberate detail, referring to the will, the clauses, the video, and the supporting documents from staff and witnesses. Daniel presented each piece of evidence with quiet clarity. When the judge reached the section of the will that included the conditional clause, he paused, scanning the words for a long moment before continuing. "This clause is clear in both intention and execution," he said. "The evidence presented supports that the conditions outlined were met. As such, the transfer of assets as described is upheld." The room stayed silent as he continued. "The provisions regarding the residents' vehicles and accounts shall be executed immediately. Carter Properties and its affiliated holdings remain in accordance with the primary will." Linda's attorney stood briefly. "Your Honor, we request additional review." The judge shook his head. "The documentation leaves no ambiguity. The decision stands." With that, he struck his gavel. The sound echoed across the room in a steady final rhythm. Linda lowered her eyes to the table, her attorney leaning close to speak to her quietly. I watched her shoulders rise and fall once, then settle into stillness. There were no harsh words, no outbursts, only the quiet acceptance of what had already been set in motion long before this day. Daniel placed a hand on the folder before him and gave me a small nod. We gathered our things and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the courtroom behind us. The afternoon light through the tall windows carried a gentler glow, warming the polished floor as we walked. When we reached the lobby, he paused at the base of the steps. "Your grandfather wanted everything clear," he said softly. "Today honors that." I thanked him, and we walked outside together before parting ways. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of early spring, and the sun sat low enough to cast long shadows across the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me before making my way toward the car. The next day, I returned to the Carter estate for the first time since the night I had been turned away. When I reached the long driveway, the iron gates opened slowly just as they always had during the years I lived there. The house looked unchanged from the outside, though a moving truck was parked near the front entrance. Linda stood near the steps directing two movers as they carried a set of suitcases toward the truck. She looked smaller than I remembered, though her posture remained straight. When she turned and saw me, she didn't speak at first. Her expression was composed, but there was a quiet strain around her eyes. The movers continued their work until the truck doors closed with a soft thud. Linda stepped forward, smoothing the sleeve of her coat. "I'll be out of your way shortly," she said. Her voice was even, though tired at the edges. I nodded. "All right." She looked toward the house once more before adding, "This wasn't how I expected things to end." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything that needed to be said. She held my gaze for another moment, then stepped away and walked toward the waiting car. As it pulled down the driveway, I remained still watching until the vehicle disappeared beyond the curve of the trees. With the house finally quiet, I walked toward the front steps. The door opened smoothly when I turned the handle, and the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers drifted out. The foyer was just as I remembered, bright, spacious, and filled with the echoes of years of afternoons and evenings spent with my grandfather. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. Each room held memories I had not allowed myself to revisit in the past few weeks. The study with its tall bookshelves, the living room where we had watched movies on winter nights, the dining table where he taught me to read contracts and understand the weight of responsibility. Everywhere I looked, I felt the presence of what he had built, not just in the structure of the house, but in the sense of purpose he had passed on. Later that week, I met with the board at Carter Properties for the first time since the will had been read. The meeting room was filled with familiar faces, executives who had worked with my grandfather for decades. Daniel joined me at the head of the table, offering steady support as I took my seat. The discussions were careful and respectful. The team briefed me on ongoing projects, financial positions, and long-term plans already in progress. I listened closely, asked questions when needed, and took notes on everything. Though I felt the weight of responsibility, I also sensed the clarity that came from knowing I wasn't walking into this alone. My grandfather had never expected me to carry his legacy by myself. He had built a team of people he trusted, and they were ready to guide me as I stepped into my role. After the meeting, I returned to the estate with a folder full of notes and a mind full of plans. The house was quiet when I entered, the late afternoon sunlight casting soft shadows across the floor. I walked through the hallway toward the study, and when I reached the doorway, I paused. His old gold watch rested on the desk just as he had left it. The metal glinted softly in the fading light. I picked it up gently and fastened it around my wrist, feeling the familiar weight settle there, a reminder of his presence, his guidance, and the trust he had placed in me. I stood at the window for a moment, looking out over the garden he had tended for so many years. The early spring blooms were just beginning to open, adding small bursts of color against the green. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt ready. The days ahead would bring new decisions, new responsibilities, and the steady work of shaping the future he had entrusted to me. And as I stepped out of the study and into the hallway, I knew I was ready to take each of those steps with the same care he had always shown. What waited next was more than a transition. It was the beginning of the life he had prepared me to lead. The first week back in the house moved gently, almost like the building itself was giving me time to settle into the space again. Each morning I walked through the garden before heading into the city, taking in the familiar paths my grandfather used to favor. The staff greeted me with the same warmth they had shown him, offering a sense of continuity that steadied me as I stepped further into the role he had prepared me for. Evenings were spent in his study, reviewing reports or reading the notes he had left behind, the quiet of the room settling around me like a soft reminder of the years we had shared. As the days unfolded, I found myself returning to the routines he had once kept. I met with the leaders at Carter Properties to understand the rhythm of the work he had done for decades. Their respect was measured but sincere, and over time I sensed their confidence growing. They answered my questions patiently, encouraged my ideas, and never made me feel out of place. Each discussion helped me see the company the way my grandfather had described it, more than a collection of projects and numbers. It was a long-term effort to build something meaningful for the community. In the quiet spaces between meetings, I spent time with Helen, who continued to manage the household with the care she had always shown. She guided me through old files, photographs, and archived letters that had been stored in the back cabinets of the study. Some of the letters were from scholarship recipients my grandfather had helped years ago, and reading their words reminded me of how deeply he had believed in second chances. One evening, as we organized the last box, Helen set aside a small envelope with my name written in his handwriting. Inside was a short note, just a few sentences, but it carried the same steady encouragement he had always given me. I read it twice before placing it carefully in the desk drawer. A few days later, I contacted the Carter Foundation and met with their director, a woman named Nancy, who had worked closely with my grandfather. We sat in a small meeting room overlooking the garden, discussing programs that had been paused in recent months. Together, we created a plan to expand the scholarship fund in his name, focusing on students whose paths resembled mine long ago. The work felt natural, even comforting. And as we finished reviewing the details, Nancy smiled and said she believed Jonathan would have been proud. The comment carried a quiet warmth that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. As the estate settled into its new rhythm, I found myself reflecting often on the weeks following the funeral. The confusion, the fear, the long nights in the motel, they felt distant now, like a chapter that had already begun to fade. What remained was not the struggle itself, but the clarity that grew from it. My grandfather had known that this moment would come, and he had trusted me to rise to it. That trust shaped everything I did in the weeks that followed. One afternoon, I stood at the top of the staircase, listening to the soft echo of distant footsteps and the faint hum of the house settling in the late sunlight. The calm that filled the space was different from the quiet of the motel or the uncertainty of the first days after the funeral. It was a steady kind of stillness, one that came from knowing the difficult part had ended and a new kind of work was beginning. As evening drew in, I returned to the study and rested my hands on the back of my grandfather's old chair. The watch he had left me sat on my wrist, warm from the day's work. I looked around the room, the shelves lined with his books, the notes he had left in the margins of documents, the photographs of projects completed long before I was born, and felt a soft sense of gratitude settle in. He had built this world with intention, and now it was my turn to honor the values he had lived by. Later, as I walked through the garden, the early blooms brushed gently against the path. The scent of fresh soil carried the memory of the afternoons we had spent planting flowers side by side. I paused near the small bench where he used to rest, feeling the cool air settle around me as the last of the daylight faded. The journey we had shared through loss, through rebuilding, through the quiet lessons of everyday moments felt complete in a way I hadn't expected. When I returned inside, I switched off the lights one by one, letting the house settle into a peaceful stillness. Standing in the foyer, I rested my hand on the railing and breathed in the familiar scent of the home that had shaped so much of my life. This place, this legacy, and the responsibilities now in my care weren't burdens. They were reminders of the strength that can grow from kindness, from clarity, and from choosing to move forward even when the path feels uncertain. If you've ever had to find your footing after a difficult chapter, I hope my story reminds you that quiet resilience carries its own kind of power. Thank you for listening, and if this journey stayed with you, feel free to share your thoughts or subscribe so we can walk through more stories together.